What happened to the lost African American recipes that carry our ancestors' legacy? These recipes once sustained families with strength, resourcefulness, and love in kitchens where every ingredient counted. If they carried so much of our story, why did we allow them to fade? Egg pie was one of those clever recipes that turned almost nothing into something sweet, filling, and comforting. It was a custard-like pie made with eggs, milk, and whatever sugar could be spared, though during times of scarcity, molasses or syrup often took the place of refined sugar. The pie baked into a golden, slightly firm custard with a texture somewhere between flan and cake, rich yet simple. Families loved it because it felt like a true dessert, even though it relied on the most basic pantry staples. Enslaved people and their descendants carried recipes like this forward, proving that resourcefulness was its own kind of art. Egg pie was especially common in rural communities where eggs were plentiful, but luxuries like cream were rare. Each bite carried a reminder of survival and the ability to create joy from limited means. It was not just about sweetness, but about finding dignity in daily life. Over time, it became a Sunday treat, something shared after church or made for gatherings. Forgotten today, egg pie once stood as a symbol of perseverance and ingenuity. Kush, also known as cornbread hash, was born directly from the need to never waste a crumb of food. Families would crumble up day-old cornbread and fry it in a skillet with pork fat or meat drippings, transforming leftovers into something hot and filling. Sometimes onions, peppers, or scraps of cured meat were tossed in for extra flavor, but even plain, it was delicious. Kush was quick, nourishing, and inexpensive, making it a survival meal that carried many through difficult times. It came from kitchens where stretching food was not a choice, but a necessity. The beauty of Kush was that it required almost nothing to prepare, just a bit of fat, a skillet, and leftover bread. For enslaved people and later generations, it was proof of resilience, turning what little they had into something flavorful. Children loved the crispy texture, while adults valued how it filled the stomach quickly. Over time, Kush became tied to memory, a dish that spoke of thrift, care, and ingenuity. Forgotten now, it was once a staple that showed how creativity turned scarcity into strength. Batter cakes were among the earliest American breakfast foods, rooted in African traditions of frying ground grains into flat cakes. These were made from cornmeal mixed with water or milk, sometimes enriched with a bit of egg or lard if the family could spare it. They were fried in a skillet with pork fat, which gave them a smoky, savory edge that balanced beautifully with molasses drizzled over the top. Hot from the pan, they were crisp on the outside and tender within, a perfect way to start the day. Families ate them plain when resources were thin, but with syrup or fruit when luck allowed. Batter cakes were deeply tied to survival, offering nourishment that could be cooked quickly over open fires. Enslaved people kept this tradition alive, carrying techniques from West Africa and adapting them to American ingredients. These humble cakes grew into the foundation for much of Southern cooking. Though forgotten today, they once symbolized endurance and culture in a world that gave little. Batter cakes carried warmth, energy, and memory with every bite. Brown flour bread was one of those foods that carried both weight and meaning, especially during times when white flour was expensive or unavailable. Made from whole grain or wheat flour, it baked into a dense, hearty loaf that filled stomachs and lasted longer than lighter breads. Though it lacked the softness of refined flour breads, it carried more nutrition, which mattered greatly for families with little else to eat. Enslaved people and poor communities relied on brown flour bread as an anchor of daily survival. It could be eaten plain with molasses or alongside stews and greens, stretching simple meals into something more substantial. Baking it required care and patience, often using outdoor ovens or hearths. While it was not seen as elegant food, it represented strength and resilience, proof that nourishment mattered more than refinement. This bread carried families through scarcity and became a quiet legacy of African American kitchens. Today it is rarely mentioned, yet it once stood as a cornerstone of sustenance and resourcefulness. Benny seed cookies were far more than just sweets. They were a direct tie to African heritage. Benny seeds, known today as sesame seeds, were brought across the Atlantic by enslaved Africans who carried their foodways in memory and practice. In African American kitchens, these seeds became the star of crisp, nutty cookies that were both simple and deeply symbolic. Mixed with flour, sugar, and butter, they baked into golden rounds that crackled with flavor. Families made them for special occasions, church gatherings, and holidays where they carried meanings of good luck and blessing. Children loved their crunch, while elders cherished their cultural significance. The tradition of baking bene seed cookies was strongest in the Lowcountry, where Gullah Geechee communities preserved African food knowledge despite oppression. These cookies embodied resilience and continuity, proving that even through bondage, identity could not be erased. Forgotten by many today, they remain a living connection to ancestral roots, carrying stories in every bite. Ash cakes were corn cakes baked directly under hot hearth coals, a method born of necessity among enslaved people who lacked proper ovens or pans. Dough was formed from cornmeal and water, sometimes with salt if available, then wrapped in leaves or placed straight into the ashes. When pulled out, brushed off, and cracked open, they revealed a smoky, chewy bread that filled empty stomachs quickly. Ash cakes were portable, easy, and required nothing more than fire and cornmeal, which made them essential for survival. Though humble, they carried immense weight as symbols of resilience in the face of brutal conditions. Families later passed them down as reminders of strength, teaching new generations how food could come from the simplest elements. The taste was rustic, earthy, and unforgettable, tied as much to memory as to nourishment. Ash cakes may no longer appear on tables, but they carry the legacy of people who created sustenance out of almost nothing. Forgotten now, they remain a quiet tribute to endurance. Goober pea stew was a dish with roots tracing directly back to West Africa, where peanuts were long a staple. In African American kitchens, peanuts, called goober peas, were simmered with vegetables, spices, and sometimes scraps of meat to create a thick, hearty stew. It was affordable, nourishing, and rich in protein, perfect for families making the most of limited supplies. The stew's flavor carried warmth and earthiness, with peanuts giving body and depth to simple ingredients. For enslaved people, it was a way to preserve traditions under impossible circumstances, blending African flavors with what was available in the Americas. Later generations continued cooking goober pea stew, especially in rural southern communities, where it was shared at gatherings and remembered as a food of both struggle and comfort. It spoke of cultural memory, resilience, and adaptation, proof that African roots remained strong across oceans and generations. Forgotten by many, it once symbolized the creativity of making abundance from scarcity. Rice fritters were another ingenious way African American families stretched meals, turning leftovers into something fresh and delicious. Leftover rice from the night before would be mixed with eggs, flour, and seasonings, then shaped into small patties and fried until golden. The result was crispy on the outside, tender inside, and surprisingly filling. Sometimes onions or herbs were added, but even plain, rice fritters made the most of what little was available. They transformed yesterday's scraps into a hot breakfast or quick side dish, showing how nothing went to waste. This recipe reflected both thrift and creativity, values passed down across generations. It also connected to African traditions of frying grains into cakes, a continuity that survived through adaptation. Rice fritters were especially popular in communities where rice was abundant, linking southern kitchens to centuries of heritage. Today they are rarely seen, but once they were symbols of resilience and invention. Forgotten now, rice fritters stand as a reminder of how African American cooking honored both survival and culture. Pea hull soup was one of those recipes that revealed just how little went to waste in African American kitchens. The hulls of peas, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly to extract every bit of flavor and nourishment. The broth was sometimes thickened with cornmeal or enriched with bits of onion, fat, or herbs if available. It was not a dish of luxury, but it carried the spirit of making something from nothing. For enslaved people and later generations living in poverty, pea hull soup was proof that even scraps could sustain life. Children grew up on it, learning the lesson that food was too precious to waste, The flavor was earthy and simple, yet it filled stomachs and carried strength. It represented resilience, care, and the power of resourcefulness in hard times. Forgotten now, pea hull soup once stood as a quiet but powerful part of African American survival and heritage. Wild green salad was one of the most direct connections to the land, born from the practice of foraging. Families gathered dandelion greens, pokeweed, or mustard leaves from fields and woods, washing and dressing them simply with vinegar or fat drippings. These greens were free, abundant, and full of nutrition, making them invaluable when money and resources were scarce. For enslaved people, foraging was sometimes the only way to add freshness and variety to an otherwise meager diet. The salads were sharp, tangy, and nourishing, teaching families that the land itself could provide. Later generations continued to gather wild greens, passing down knowledge of which plants were safe and when to pick them. These salads were not just food, but a link to both survival and tradition, carrying cultural memory through taste. Today, wild green salad is nearly forgotten, but it remains a reminder of resilience and ingenuity. It shows how African American kitchens created abundance from what others overlooked. Molasses taffy pulls were more than just candy. They were events that brought communities together in kitchens and porches across the South. Families would boil molasses until it was thick and bubbling, then pour it out to cool before pulling and stretching the sticky ropes by hand. Children loved the fun of twisting and shaping the glossy strands, while adults enjoyed the rare sweetness in a time when sugar was scarce. It was a messy job, with sticky fingers and laughter filling the room, but the result was worth it. Chewy, flavorful candy that tasted like nothing store-bought. For many African American families, a molasses taffy pull was not only a treat, but also a social moment, a chance to gather, share stories, and find joy despite hardship. The strong, earthy sweetness of molasses carried history in its taste, reminding people of both struggle and survival. Forgotten today, it once symbolized celebration and community spirit, proof that even in scarcity, sweetness could be shared. Baked raccoon may sound unusual to modern ears, but in rural African American communities, it was a common and practical dish. Hunting was an important way to supplement diets when money or access to meat was limited, and raccoon provided a reliable source of protein. The meat was cleaned carefully, often soaked to reduce its strong flavor, then seasoned and baked slowly until tender. Families would serve it with root vegetables or cornbread, turning what some might see as wild game into a hearty family meal. It was not considered exotic or strange at the time. It was simply another way to make use of what the land provided. Children grew up eating raccoon without second thought, knowing it was part of the rhythm of survival. For many, it carried the taste of the woods, a reminder that food could always be found if you knew where to look. Forgotten now, baked raccoon was once a vital dish that showed ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Hog maw was one of the most resourceful dishes in African American kitchens, turning a pig's stomach into something hearty and sustaining. The stomach was carefully cleaned, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, sausage, or other fillings before being stewed slowly. What might have been discarded elsewhere became a centerpiece dish, full of flavor and nourishment. Families appreciated hog maw because it made use of every part of the animal, a practice born from necessity during slavery and carried forward through generations. It was especially common during holidays or gatherings, when stretching ingredients to feed many was essential. The dish carried strong flavors with seasonings and fat infusing the filling as it cooked. Children often learned early on that nothing should be wasted, and hog maw embodied that lesson clearly. Though less common today, it once stood as a symbol of thrift and tradition, proving that every cut had value. Forgotten now, hog maw was a dish of pride as much as necessity. Souse, also known as head cheese, was a dish created from the parts of the animal most people overlooked. Pig heads were boiled for hours, extracting every bit of meat, then mixed with vinegar and seasonings before being set into a gelatinous loaf. It was sliced and eaten cold, often with bread or pickles, providing protein in an inexpensive form. African American families adopted souse as part of their cooking tradition, making sure no part of the hog went to waste. It may sound unappealing to modern tastes, but to past generations, it was a valuable way to preserve and stretch meat. The vinegar gave it a tangy bite that cut through its richness, making it flavorful despite humble origins. For communities where every scrap mattered, Souse was both survival and ingenuity. It carried forward lessons of thrift and resourcefulness, binding families to traditions that honored the animal fully. Forgotten now, it remains part of a legacy of making something meaningful out of little. Chow relish was a bright, tangy condiment that made winter meals lively when fresh vegetables were long gone. Families gathered leftover garden produce, cabbage, peppers, onions, and green tomatoes, chopping and preserving them with vinegar and spices. The result was a colorful relish that added flavor to beans, greens, and meats during lean months. African-American households cherished chow because it represented thrift and foresight, ensuring nothing from the garden went to waste. Children grew up seeing jars of chow lining pantry shelves, reminders of summer's abundance saved for harder days. Its tart, spicy flavor was both refreshing and practical, bringing balance to heavy meals. Making chow was also a communal task, with families and neighbors often working together during harvest time to prepare jars. This simple relish carried the memory of gardens, sunshine, and community into the coldest months. Though forgotten by many, it once stood as a symbol of preparation and connection. Chow embodied both heritage and survival, proof that even scraps could create joy. Sweet potato coffee was a creative substitute born from necessity when real coffee was too expensive or unavailable. Sweet potatoes were sliced, roasted until dark, then ground into a coarse powder and brewed like traditional coffee. The drink was earthy, slightly sweet, and comforting, offering warmth in the morning even if it lacked caffeine. African-American families turned to it during hard times, stretching resources while still enjoying the ritual of a morning cup. It showed resilience, proving that even when luxuries were out of reach, tradition could still be honored. Children often drank sweet potato coffee alongside adults, since it was gentle and less bitter. For many, it carried the familiar smell of roasting in the kitchen, a scent tied to family and survival. Forgotten today, it once held great meaning, representing both frugality and creativity. Sweet potato coffee was never about indulgence, but about keeping dignity and routine alive in the face of scarcity. Parched corn was one of the oldest and simplest foods, carried forward from Native American and African traditions. Whole kernels were dried, then roasted until crunchy, creating a portable snack that kept well for long periods. For African American families, parched corn was both sustenance and heritage, a food that tied them to land and memory. It could be eaten plain, mixed into stews, or carried in pockets for long days in the fields. Children often enjoyed it like candy, crunching on kernels between meals. Adults appreciated its practicality, since it was inexpensive and easy to make in large batches. Enslaved people carried parched corn as a travel ration, proof of its importance for survival. The taste was earthy, nutty, and simple, but it carried enormous meaning, reminding families of endurance. Forgotten now, parched corn was once a cornerstone of resilience, teaching that even the humblest foods could sustain life. Hominy grit cakes were a clever way to make sure nothing went to waste. Leftover grits, once cooled, were shaped into patties and fried in fat until crisp on the outside and soft within. They were sometimes topped with syrup, gravy, or bits of meat, making them adaptable to whatever was available. African-American families valued grit cakes because they stretched food further, creating another meal from yesterday's pot. They were quick to prepare and filling, a simple breakfast or side dish that carried both thrift and comfort. Children liked the crispy edges, while adults appreciated the versatility. Grit cakes reflected the creativity of survival cooking, proving that even scraps could be turned into something delicious. They carried the memory of hearth kitchens where nothing was discarded. Forgotten today, grit cakes were once essential, reminding families that food had to be respected and used wisely. They remain a quiet testament to resourcefulness. Blackstrap molasses tea was one of those drinks that blurred the line between medicine and comfort. A spoonful of molasses stirred into hot water created a dark, sweet drink that was rich in iron and minerals. Families drank it not only for warmth but also for health, since molasses was believed to restore strength and energy. It was especially common among African American households that valued both thrift and tradition. Children sipped it when they were sick or tired, while adults drank it to stretch resources in place of more expensive beverages. The flavor was strong, earthy, and bittersweet, carrying the taste of history in every sip. For many, it represented more than a drink. It was a way of caring for the body and soul when little else was available. Forgotten now, Blackstrap molasses tea once stood as both comfort and remedy, proving that even the simplest kitchen staples could hold power. Rabbit and dumplings was one of the most practical one-pot meals in rural African American kitchens. Rabbits were often hunted or trapped, providing much-needed meat when money was scarce. The rabbit was simmered slowly until tender, then combined with simple flour dumplings that thickened the broth into a hearty stew. Families loved it because it was both nourishing and affordable, feeding many with just a few ingredients. Children enjoyed the soft dumplings, while adults valued the protein-rich rabbit meat. It was a dish tied to the land, reflecting the importance of foraging and self-reliance in communities where access to markets was limited. Cooking rabbit and dumplings was also a communal act, often shared at family gatherings or neighborhood meals. Forgotten today, it once carried deep meaning, representing not only thrift but also togetherness. It was a food of survival and comfort, embodying both heritage and endurance. Persimmon pudding was one of those southern staples that turned wild fruit into something warm, sweet, and deeply comforting. Families gathered ripe persimmons from trees in the fall, straining out the seeds and pulp before mixing the fruit into a batter of flour, sugar, and spices. Baked slowly until it set into a dense pudding, the dessert carried a deep, caramel-like flavor with hints of cinnamon and nutmeg. African American families cherished persimmon pudding because it cost little, yet felt rich and celebratory, especially around holidays. Children loved it with a drizzle of cream, while elders saw it as part of the rhythm of the seasons. The pudding carried ties to both land and tradition, proof that overlooked fruits could be turned into something extraordinary. For communities who lived close to the earth, recipes like this reflected not just thrift, but also joy. Forgotten now, persimmon pudding once stood as a proud marker of Southern kitchens, binding families to heritage through taste. Turnip top soup was a dish born of resourcefulness, using the leafy greens from turnips that others might have thrown away. African American families saved those tops, washing and simmering them into broths flavored with onions, drippings, or bits of salt pork when available. The result was a thin but nourishing soup, earthy and slightly bitter, that filled stomachs in lean times. It represented the philosophy that nothing should ever be wasted, especially in households where every scrap mattered. Children often learned early on to appreciate greens, not just for taste, but for the lessons they carried about survival. This soup was tied to the land, reflecting both necessity and ingenuity. Families found comfort in bowls of turnip top soup, sharing warmth around the table even when ingredients were few. Forgotten today, it remains a testament to resilience and respect for food. It showed that with care, even discarded parts of vegetables could become a meal worth remembering. Cornfield pea cakes were simple, savory patties made from mashed peas mixed with cornmeal, then pan-fried until crisp on the outside and tender within. They were common in African American kitchens, where stretching food was always a priority. Cornfield peas, sometimes called field peas, were inexpensive and easy to grow, making them a reliable staple. When paired with cornmeal, they created a dish that could feed many while using very little. These cakes were sometimes seasoned with onions, peppers, or spices when available, adding depth to their humble flavor. Children liked them hot from the skillet, often eaten plain or with a splash of vinegar. Adults appreciated their practicality, turning basic ingredients into something hearty and sustaining. They carried echoes of West African traditions of frying legumes into cakes, keeping culture alive through adaptation. Forgotten now, cornfield pea cakes once embodied thrift, resilience, and heritage, proving that even the humblest foods could carry legacy and strength in every bite. Baked possum with sweet potatoes was one of the most distinctive survival dishes in rural African American communities. Possum, trapped or hunted in the woods, was a common source of protein when other meats were scarce. It was cleaned carefully, then seasoned and baked slowly, often alongside sweet potatoes from the family garden. The potatoes absorbed the savory juices of the meat, balancing its strong flavor with sweetness. Families relied on meals like this during lean times, proof that food could always be found with skill and resourcefulness. Children sometimes balked at eating possum, but for many households, it was simply another part of life. Elders passed down methods for preparing it so the meat was tender and flavorful. While the dish may seem unusual today, it once represented ingenuity and survival in communities that used every resource available. Forgotten now, baked possum with sweet potatoes remains a striking example of resilience and cultural memory preserved in kitchens. Molasses stack cake was a dessert that reflected both community and tradition. Thin layers of cake were baked individually, then stacked one upon another with sweet, sticky molasses spread in between. Preparing it often required several people, with neighbors or relatives each baking a layer and bringing it together at gatherings or weddings. The cake was dense, dark, and rich, with the molasses seeping into the layers over time, making it more flavorful as it rested. African American families loved stack cakes because they symbolized sharing. Everyone contributed something small that built into something grand. It was inexpensive compared to elaborate desserts, yet still felt special and celebratory. Children anticipated slicing into the tall cake, while adults cherished its deeper meaning of community. Forgotten today, molasses stack cake once embodied generosity, patience, and the spirit of togetherness. It was a dessert that carried heritage in both taste and tradition, connecting families and neighbors across generations. Pone pudding was a humble dish that turned cornmeal, molasses, and milk into something both filling and comforting. Baked slowly until it firmed into a custard-like texture, it carried the sweetness of molasses blended with the rustic flavor of cornmeal. African American families valued it because it was inexpensive, simple to prepare, and relied on pantry staples that were almost always available. Children enjoyed it as a dessert, while adults often ate it as a breakfast or side dish. Its versatility made it a fixture in kitchens where thrift was essential. The pudding carried echoes of both African grain dishes and European baked custards, blending traditions into something uniquely American. It was tied to survival yet also to care, proving that even modest ingredients could create food that soothed the spirit. Forgotten today, Pone pudding once stood as a reminder of how ingenuity shaped daily meals, carrying legacy and resilience in every bite shared at the table. Crab boil in the Low Country was not just a meal but a communal tradition tied to the Gullah Geechee people and coastal African American communities. Fresh crab, corn, potatoes, and sometimes sausage were boiled together with spices in large pots, then poured out onto tables for everyone to share. The meal was messy, lively, and joyful, bringing neighbors and families together. For African American households in the region, crab boil carried heritage from West African cooking, where seafood and communal dining were central. Children loved the excitement of cracking shells, while adults enjoyed the blend of flavors steeped into every bite. It was both sustenance and celebration, proof that food was never only about eating, but also about togetherness. Forgotten outside the region today, crab boil once represented pride, culture, and joy in abundance, even when resources were modest. It remains a living tradition that connects communities to both the sea and their ancestral roots. Vinegar pie was a clever solution to the problem of scarcity, created during times when lemons were too expensive or unavailable. Families substituted vinegar for lemon juice, whisking it with sugar, butter, and eggs to create a custard-like pie filling that was tangy and sweet. African American households embraced this recipe because it turned simple ingredients into something special, proving that creativity could overcome shortage. The pie was baked until golden, its tart flavor surprising to those expecting plain sweetness. Children often grew up loving it without realizing its humble origins. For adults, vinegar pie carried the lesson that even hard times could yield moments of joy. It was a dessert that showed both thrift and ingenuity, rooted in resilience. Forgotten now, vinegar pie remains a striking example of how resourceful kitchens made do. It was never just about flavor, but about dignity, turning scarcity into something worth sharing around the family table. Sweet potato biscuits were a beloved staple in African American kitchens, blending the earthy sweetness of sweet potatoes into tender, flaky biscuits. Mashed potatoes were mixed into the dough, giving the biscuits both flavor and softness. They were served hot from the oven, often with butter, molasses, or honey, making them a favorite for both children and adults. Sweet potato biscuits were inexpensive to make, since potatoes were plentiful and easy to grow. They carried nourishment and comfort, becoming a signature dish in many families. For African American households, they symbolized both thrift and creativity, taking something humble and making it delicious. They also connected to heritage, echoing traditions of root vegetables used in African cooking. Forgotten by many today, sweet potato biscuits once stood as a proud example of everyday cooking that carried memory and warmth. They remain a reminder of how food can be both survival and joy, binding families together through flavor. Juba stew was a hearty one-pot meal made from beans, greens, and scraps of meat simmered together slowly until rich and flavorful. It was a communal dish, often cooked in large pots to feed families and neighbors at once. African American communities valued it because it made the most of inexpensive ingredients, stretching scraps into something that nourished many. The stew carried influences from West African cooking, where beans and greens were central staples. Children enjoyed it with cornbread, dipping into the thick broth, while adults appreciated its ability to sustain energy through long days. Juba stew reflected the spirit of togetherness, where sharing mattered as much as eating. It was never a dish of excess, but one of comfort, dignity, and resilience. Forgotten today, it once carried the legacy of endurance and cultural memory, reminding families that survival was strongest when meals were shared. It remains a symbol of heritage hidden in the flavors of a simple pot of stew. Which lost African American recipe would you bring back? Comment below, then like and subscribe to keep these legacies alive.